Focus on Headline. All right, let's take a look at what major issues are making the headlines today on Focus on Headline. For this, joining us in the studio, we have first off Yoo Soo-min and Yoon Suk-yeol joining us in the studio once again. Guys, welcome back.
Hello. Good evening, Esther.
All right, the big news of the day. We're going to start things off. Summit diplomacy. President Yoon Suk-yeol, of course, after his trip to London to take part in the state funeral for Queen Elizabeth II, he went over to New York to take part in the UN General Assembly, which, of course, we talked about yesterday, the 11-minute long keynote speech. Of course, with this also, with so many of the world leaders taking part at the UN General Assembly, a lot of focus on the one-on-ones, the summit talks on the sidelines of the UN General Assembly. Big question on whether or not there was going to be a summit talk between the leaders of South Korea and Japan. It did happen. President Yoon Suk-yeol holding talks with his Japanese counterpart, Prime Minister Fumio Kishida. Let's get more on this, Soonin.
Sure. So, as you said, Esther, South Korean President Yoon Suk-yeol and Japanese Prime Minister Fumio Kishida met in New York on Wednesday local time on the sidelines of the UN General Assembly. Well, South Korea's presidential office stated that both leaders agreed on the need to improve bilateral relations by resolving pending issues, of course, the wartime forced labors. Well, agendas were not set in advance because it was a brief meeting called 회담 in Korean, which the presidential office described as informal meeting that lasted for 30 minutes in a conference meeting close to the UN headquarters, but still, it does appear to have touched on issues of multiple mutual concerns. A deputy presidential spokesperson, Lee Jae-myung, well, not the DP party leader, obviously, said in a written briefing, well, he said that the both leaders shared serious concerns about North Korea's nuclear program, including its recent legalization of nuclear arms and the possibility of its seventh nuclear test, agreeing on the need to cooperate closely with the international community for a coordinated response. Well, the meeting, albeit a brief one, of course, marked the first one-on-one talks between the leaders of the two nations since December 2019, raising hopes of improving the frayed relations, especially as President Yoon Suk-yeol seeks to enhance ties with the neighboring country. Well, the presidential office described this as a first step toward producing tangible results, but it was immediately not clear whether the wartime forced labor issue was directly addressed.
Yeah, so this was the topic that was highly contentious in that, even the Japanese side before this meeting even took place, they were like, well, listen, I don't think the two sides should hold summit talks unless we find out who's going to be resolving this wartime issues, the compensation of the forced laborers and things like that. And this is eventually going to be the key topic, right? Whether or not the two leaders or the governments of the two countries can resolve this, and then you can further improve the ties between the two countries, which, let's face it, I think still at this time, although we've seen some improvements, it's still quite icy. Let's just put it at that. But what's interesting here is that many of these news outlets have been talking about how the two nations described the talks between the two leaders.
Yeah, well, so you could say the discrepancy was subtle, or you could say it's conspicuous regarding the wording, how they chose to refer to the meeting, because Seoul referred to the Wednesday event as quote-unquote informal meeting, while Tokyo classified it as quote-unquote informal talks. So meeting and talks, those were, different wordings that they used. So some analysts are seeing this distinct choice in how they portray the encounter. This is intended to convey Japan's perception that the discussion was not held in an official capacity, showing a more cautious attitude. Well, the bilateral meeting also was held strictly in private. It was not released to the media immediately, and as no specific agenda or practical progress were reportedly made on sensitive issues like Japan's wartime forced labor, it really spurred contrasting views and reactions to this brief meeting.
Yeah, it's almost like Japan's playing that hard to get kind of thing at this time, because if they say it was a formal summit, and then what's the outcome of it? Were there any fruitful results? If it's Japan, hey, were you guys able to resolve the whole issue of the compensation? Because Japan certainly doesn't want to compensate the forced laborers. But again, I mean, I think there were high expectations with this summit. I think they were hoping that the two leaders will eventually talk about the historical issues. But first and foremost, speaking of the forced laborers and how to kind of resolve this issue, Seong, what are some of the experts saying they need to kind of, the way that they need to resolve this issue?
Well, the Public-Private Council formed by the Foreign Ministry, they have two suggestions. First is a subrogation, which allows a third party, in this case, South Korean government, first compensates the victims and then takes over the rights from the creditor and exercises the right to indemnity, which means South Korean government will ask the Japanese companies for reimbursement later. Second, the consultative body launched by Foreign Ministry suggests that it's whole to create a fund to encourage donations from both South Korean and Japanese companies to pay the victims. But how does that sound to you guys? Reasonable?
I don't think there should
not
be
really,
any
right?
compensation from any of the South Korean side. That's just my
Right.
2 cents
And
on it.
victims are
Obviously.
strongly opposed to those proposals as well
Yeah.
because what they really want is not only the financial compensation, but the sincere apology, right? And further, despite these suggestions from South Korea, Japan is also rejecting them, arguing that a 1965 claims agreement settled all issues of compensation to victims of colonial rule once and for all. So it's highly likely that this forced labor compensation issue will remain unresolved for the time being. And experts from outside the consultative body also say it's hard to expect any change in Japan's stance even after the Korea-Japan summit took place, because obviously the compensation issue reportedly was not mentioned during Yoon Kishida meeting, and they say the two sides will have to continue to hold working level negotiations on this issue and make diplomatic efforts to find a solution.
The problem with this is the only thing that Japan wants to hear from South Korea is, listen, you don't have to compensate the victims anymore. Whether that means that the victims are never going to get compensated or the South Korean government decides to compensate them. But on the flip side, though, if the South Korean government decides to go on that route, then, of course, the victims, not just the victims, but I'm sure the South Korean citizens, there's going to be huge uproar. I mean, why is the South Korean company or South Korean government paying for something that was done wrong by the Japanese?
And the victims also say there's only one solution, which is the Japanese firms compensate the victims.
That's the only solution, but that's the one thing that Japan does not want to do,
I know, so-
which is why this is never going to be resolved. In my case. And I think the Yoon administration, they're being more cautious because they know about the 2015 deal with the forced sex slavery, right? Where it was kind of done without the consultation of the victims, and that caused an uproar, obviously, and they don't want this. But I want to kind of get what the political arena is, the political parties are kind of responding to this Korea-Japan summit, because it did happen, right? Whether it be 30 minutes or, 3 hours, it still happened. But with President Yoon and his meetings, there's been some interesting kind of responses from different political parties. Also, we have the Prime Minister heading over to Japan to take part in the state funeral for Shinzo Abe. Let's get the political side of things, Sumin.
Sure. Well, as you said, as shared, the rival parties clash over some or most of the issues, and most of the majority of the issues, obviously. And the distinct perspectives and how they saw this meeting were very clear, judging by their statements and remarks. So the ruling People Power Party said, what they said was that the meeting served as a breakthrough for the normalization of Seoul-Tokyo ties, which the party said had been destroyed by the previous Moon Jae-in administration. The PPP also said that bilateral ties began to thaw with a quote-unquote warm breeze after suffering years of strain, obviously with the launch of Yoon government, citing the recent resumption of flights between Seoul's Gimpo and Tokyo's Haneda airports, not to mention the exemption of quarantine upon entry to Japan as an example of such improvement. Well, Chairman Jung Jin-seok from the PPP expressed resolve to put the Korea-Japan relations back to the days of Kim Dae-jung and Nobuchi times, which obviously was when the relationship was at its best. But the main opposition, Democratic Party, called the pursuit and the outcome, quote-unquote, humiliating. Well, Park Hong-gun, the leader, noted that there was no specific agenda or practical progress made on what he described as most important issues like the Japan's wartime forced labor that we just talked about, and that one-sided unilateral courtship from the South Korean side without installing taegukgi at the meeting demonstrates concerns about the Yoon Suk-yeol government's empty-handed and servile diplomacy, and that has become a reality. Well, Next week, Prime Minister Han Duck-soo is planning to visit Japan for Abe's state funeral, and Han Duck-soo and Kishida will hold talks for about 15 minutes. And today, when he stood before the National Assembly, when the main opposition Democratic Party asked about his opinion regarding this bilateral meeting, he said, I think President Yoon Suk-yeol has said enough, and he conveyed his thoughts that he wanted to bring to the table. That was his response. And also by citing his personal experience, he said that the itineraries during the UN General Assembly obviously is very complicated, as that is the stage for multilateral diplomacy. So again, he's going to hold a 15 minutes talk next week. It's shorter than that of the president's, obviously. So eyes are on, on the development and how the meeting will go with Kishida and Han Duck-soo.
I mean, I think the word embarrassing is kind of a bit harsh,
Yeah.
I think, because if you take into consideration, even if it was like a DP leader, if the president was a DP and he tried to resolve, there's no one that could resolve this issue right now. If they were to hold a 30-minute talk with Kishida, I don't think they were going to be able to resolve the issue of compensating the victims. And that's just the thing. It doesn't matter who. No one is going to be happy. There's no win-win situation with this thing unless, for some miraculous reason, the Japanese companies decide to compensate, the victims. Then it's a win-win situation, I guess. Well, it's more win for Korea than in that case, but it's a tough one. I'm going to be honest with you, and I don't think anybody expected some fruitful result to come out of the Yoon Kishida summit talk. But you know what is really ironic is, though, there were some speculations that the Yoon Kishida summit was not going to happen because, that's what the Jap. But what we did know was going to happen was, before this, was that President Yoon Suk-yeol and U.S. President Joe Biden were going to sit down for talks, for a summit talk. This actually did not take place. Instead, what happened was in New York, in a different forum, I believe, at a different event, they had a brief chat. Brief is the key word here. Seon, let's get the details of this.
Right. President Yoon Suk-yeol attended the Global Fund's 7th Replenishment Conference hosted by Biden, a fundraising event for fighting infectious diseases. And there, he met briefly with U.S. President Joe Biden in New York on Wednesday. And President Yoon was originally not on the list of the attendees, but was invited later on as Yoon expressed his willingness to contribute to the Global Fund to fight diseases in his keynote speech at the UN General Assembly. And after the event, after the photo session, President Yoon met with President Biden, among other leaders of other countries, and talked for about 48 seconds. And it was very brief, more like small talk or a brief encounter, I'll rather say. But, from a diplomatic point of view, the talks between two leaders can never be meaningless, no matter how short it is. So during that short conversation in less than a minute, the two are believed to have talked about North Korea's threat. And according to the White House, the two leaders reaffirmed their commitment to strengthen their cooperation against North's growing nuclear threats. And Washington added Yoon and Biden also pledged to continuously cooperate on a wide range of urgent issues, including supply chain resilience, critical technologies, economic and energy security, global health, and climate change. And still, although the two are expected to continue discussions on important global issues in the future, but there are also criticism over the altered diplomatic schedule, as Wednesday's brief chat has replaced the highly anticipated second Yoon-Biden summit. And that's because Seoul and Washington now have some critical issues to talk about, such as the Inflation Reduction Act. But as the two failed to have an official face-to-face meeting, people who expected that the summit could serve as an opportunity to find a more specific and practical solution to the IRA issue felt very disappointed.
Yeah, you know what? It really does just seem like Joe Biden is trying to avoid any kind of discussions in the IRA. He knows that because of the Inflation Reduction Act, which, by the way, looks really awesome for the Americans. It's make America. What is it? It's America first, right?
Yeah.
Everything is garnered towards America, whereas the rest of the world, which we all thought America, the United States, were a close ally, whether it be South Korea, the EU, I believe even Japanese automakers as well. They're all affected by this. They're all very much upset by this. And I think he knows this. And he's trying to avoid the talks because he knows that President Yoon, when he's at these summits, that's all he's going to want to talk about. And that's all he should want to talk about at this time.
Right.
But although we don't have a specific solution to this just yet. We don't know. Washington keeps saying, well, we'll look into it. We'll see what happens and things like that.
Right?
Still, though, rightfully so, according to the presidential office, President Yoon conveyed his concerns about the IRA through short conversations with President Biden.
Right. The presidential office said President Yoon had several chances to have brief talks with Biden in London and New York 3 times in total. And it said Yoon expressed his concerns about the U.S. Inflation Reduction Act, asking for a close cooperation between Seoul and Washington to resolve concerns growing among Korean automakers. In response, President Biden said he was well aware of South Korea's concerns and hoped 2 countries would continue on the consultations. But this is no different from what the U.S. National Security Advisor Jake Sullivan and Deputy Secretary of State Wendy Sherman or Undersecretary Jose Fernandez repeated during the meetings with their South Korean counterparts. So it's hard to say that the results people expected from Yoon-Biden the summit have come out. Well, besides IRA, the two seems to have indirectly discussed the currency swap as well. According to the top office, Yoon and Biden also agreed to closely cooperate on the implementation of liquidity facilities if deemed necessary for financial stability.
But I think what President Yoon, if indeed in those several brief meetings that he had with Biden, he continued to push for, listen, we got to talk about this IRA, man. I mean, listen, it's not good for our automakers. It's not good for our companies. Come on, what happened to the Chorus FDA? What happened to the alliance that we had? What happened to the close cooperation? You got to work something out for us. If he's continued to push for that, and if some South Korean officials continue to push, that's a good thing, right? That's a good thing. But unfortunately, we just continue to get the same answer over and over again, which I think,
so we understand your situation.
We got the message,
There's nothing we can do much.
We got the message. I think the U.S. is delivering their message. Listen, we're just going to go forward with this. And there's nothing that you can do. Well, let's see. Well, when the chip 4 comes up and you guys need those semiconductors, I wonder what's going to happen there. President Yoon had still their summit talks also with his German counterpart in New York. Sumi, let's get more on this.
Sure. So South Korean President Yoon Suk-yeol and German Chancellor Olaf Scholz had their first summit in New York on Wednesday, also on the sidelines of the UN General Assembly. During the summit, the two agreed to work to deepen their countries' bilateral relationships through diverse exchanges at every level, especially as next year marks the 140th anniversary of commencing exchanges between the two countries. A deputy presidential spokesperson Lee Jae-myung also said that the both leaders agreed on the large potential for cooperation between their countries in terms of economic security issues, mainly in tackling the recent global supply chain disruptions, and the two pledged to strengthen necessary communications and cooperations. Well, the two leaders also exchanged views on their respective Indo-Pacific strategies and some changes in international dynamics, obviously caused by the war in Ukraine, while agreeing to continue cooperation for the establishment of the peace on the Korean Peninsula.
All right, there you have it, with all these different meetings taking place. And I believe now President Yoon Suk-yeol is headed over to Canada, and he's going to be having a sit down with Canadian Prime Minister Justin Trudeau. We'll have more on that later this week, or I guess tomorrow's later this week. We're going to talk money this time. We've been talking about the $1 exchange rate for quite a bit now. Obviously, the South Korean won depreciating quite a bit against the greenback for some time now. Now, finally, it's hit that mark, the 1,400 mark that we've been dreading. This was surpassed on was it today? Was it Thursday, right? First time in 13 years and 6 months that we saw numbers like this. And this is, of course, because of the U.S. Fed announcing their interest rate hike. So, Sam, tell us more about this.
Yes, the local currency topped 1,404.1 per dollar as of 9:13 a.m. on Thursday, up 9.91 from the previous day, and it closed at 1,409.71, up 15.51 from Wednesday. And South Korean stocks also closed lower than the day before. Korea's benchmark Kospi lost 14.8 0.90 points to close at 2,332.31. KOSPI lost 3.48 points, closing at 751.41. And it's really concerning because usually we called the 1400 mark the psychological level, which also heavily affects the public sentiment. And Sumin's going to give you more details later, but the dollar strengthened even more after the U.S. Central Bank raised its benchmark interest rate by 0.75 percentage points Wednesday, taking another giant step following June and July. And dollar index, which used to measure the value of the dollar against a basket of 6 foreign currencies and represents the dollar's value against the currencies of 6 major countries, surpassed 111 and rose to its highest level in 20 years as well. And when the dollar continues to strengthen, countries that use the currencies of the 6 major countries that determine the dollar index get greatly affected, and the EU is an example because EU's value continues to fall. But the Korean won, which does not belong to the 6 global currencies, is still getting heavily affected by a strengthened dollar, and the exchange rate is soaring. And of course, Fed's interest rate hikes and strong dollar is one of the major reasons, but experts urge the government to find out and solve other domestic reasons or factors behind the weakening of local currency as well. For example, like exports can be one of the reasons because the latest trade data show for the first time in 25 years, South Korea is on course to post a trade deficit for a 6th straight month.
Yeah, I mean, it was expected. I mean, we could say that that's the psychological limit. I mean, the level, but I mean, so was 1,300, so was 1,200. I really remember when it was...
now it's 1,400.
I remember when it was just slightly over 1,001. But again...
Good times.
The biggest reason for why the U.S. Fed's, the dollar rallied against the Korean won once again is because of that giant step that the U.S. Fed took once again. The giant step, meaning another 75 basis point here. Sumin, tell us about this decision and also the future projections down the line.
Sure. Well, the U.S. Central Bank policymakers on Wednesday local time unanimously made a decision to raise its benchmark interest rate by 0.75 of a percentage point. Now, that for the 3rd straight time, and that basically sent a chill and has sent shockwaves around the globe. Well, as a result, the federal funds rate rose to a range of 3 to 3.25%, which is obviously the highest since 2008 during the financial crisis. And the Fed even hinted at further rate hikes. The Fed Chair Jerome Powell also reaffirmed his resolution to tame down inflation, saying that he would, quote-unquote, keep at it until the job is done. Fed Chair Jerome Powell also said that the inflation level has not fallen as much as the central bank had expected that it would by at this point, as the Fed foresees its policy rate rising at a faster pace. And then he also shared understanding that it may be realistically difficult to manage a soft landing. He added that the chances of a soft landing will diminish if policy needs to get more restrictive for the Fed to reach its goal of 2% inflation. However, emphasizing the high inflation would inflict greater pain longer term. Obviously, he's very adamant of his pledge, of his hawkish stance. He also pledged to continue raising interest rates to tame down on inflation because the Fed is expected to increase rates by at least 1.25 percentage points in the 2 remaining meetings this year. Well, that would possibly be implemented by one more giant step, 0.75 basis point rate hike, and one big step, 0.5 percentage point rate hike in the 2 FOMC meetings during the remainder of this year. Well, as the committee is strongly focused on returning the inflation level to the 2% objective, even after risk of unemployment rising and growth slowing to a stall, there are the worries that this consistent rate hike with new projections showing a level of 4.25% to 4.5% range by the end of this year, there are some legitimate concerns that this could potentially put the economy at the borderline of a recession.
Everyone's trying to fight inflation right now. The biggest reason for why they continue to raise these interest rates, and not just the U.S. Fed, but the BOK has been. Although the BOK hasn't been as aggressive as the U.S. Fed for a number of reasons, but. It's ironic because there are criticisms, assuming that the strong dollar could actually export inflation to the world with the U.S. adhering to its policy.
Yeah, so Wall Street Journal, which is obviously a major global media outlet, straightforwardly wrote that strong US dollar is the biggest threat to the global economy. And reasons, multiple indicators that the strong dollar is becoming a negative factor that is intensifying inflation in other major countries across the globe. Well, the dollar index, which Taeyong mentioned before, which represents the dollar's value against major currencies, has soared more than 14% this year, which was obviously the largest increase since 1984. Well, the euro, the Japanese yen, the British pound also fell to the lowest levels in decades against the dollar. So this is the reason why the World Bank warned of a possible financial crisis in emerging and developing countries, saying that the global economy is essentially heading for a recession. And, the major problem is that the dollar is likely to remain strong for the time being, as we discussed, especially until the end of this year to, quash this soaring inflation.
That's right. It's really unfortunate right now. I mean, what was it? I think we're now at like 14% or 15% that the U.S. dollar has increased against the Korean won, and it doesn't seem like it's going to slow down any further.
No.
But will there be more hikes? Moving on, we'll have to see. But in response to all this, we had South Korea's finance minister saying that South Korea will actively manage the volatility of the financial market within a short period of time while implementing economic policies from a very broad perspective, considering the economic condition outlooks. So, Seong, tell us about his remarks.
Yes, Finance Minister Chu Kyung-ho at the Emergency Macroeconomic Finance Conference held at the Seoul Bank Hall said that the rising uncertainties in both the domestic financial and foreign exchange markets are likely to continue for a time being. And South Korean government will take measures step by step to ease foreign exchange supply and demand imbalances by managing pension funds and foreign investment as well. And Chu added that current economic relevant ministries and institutions are monitoring key indicators to catch the signs of an economic crisis in real time by closely monitoring markets and preparing for various scenarios, such as the U.S. Fed threat of tightening, China's economic slowdown, and the possibility of economic crisis in emerging countries. Meanwhile, Bank of Korea Governor Lee Chang-yong also announced the countermeasures against another steep Fed rate hike. He said on Thursday that the preconditions for a 0.25 percentage point hike has changed a lot, hinting at the possibility of raising the benchmark interest rate by half a percentage point next month instead of 0.25%.
I'm not happy with this. Anyway, go ahead.
Yeah, so he added, as Bank of Korea has 2 to 3 weeks until the next Monetary Policy Committee, it will closely examine the impact of these external factors and decide on its rate adjustment. In the meantime, in an effort to ease the fears of a weakening won, the Bank of Korea is seeking to conclude a currency swap agreement with the National Pension Service to allow the central bank to give its US dollar to the National Pension Service in exchange for the won from the NPS. But what you say, this can only be a temporary solution, that we need a more fundamental solution that can stop won from continuing to depreciate against a strong dollar.
So this is the problem, right? The Bank of Korea and the rest of the world, they were increasing their interest rate so that they could fight inflation. Now,
Right.
has that led to decrease in consumer prices? No. Now, what's happening now is now they have to increase it even further because they have to fight against the U.S. dollar going too strong, right?
Right.
And so, my goodness, the United States, we can't keep up with the giant height. So another 50 basis points because
Jerome Powell said that soft landing will not be possible. We have to bear some
Difficult times.
difficult times.
But difficult times.
It's unavoidable, he said.
You know what's interesting is that this is actually one of the reasons for why the creator of Bitcoin made Bitcoin is because he was saying the U.S. dollar basically affects the rest of the world's currency, and he or she didn't like this. Actually, we don't know who the creator of Bitcoin is. It might be a he or a she, but of course, Bitcoin was used for other stuff. But this is really concerning because 50 basis point in South Korea, this is major. They did say also that South Korea, the central bank here, they're probably going to be extending
Yes.
the length of their interest rate longer than the U.S. Fed. And of course, I mentioned the reason why is because, all the people that bought houses during the pandemic,
Including yourself.
You consistently warned against it.
I warned against it, which is why I didn't buy.
Consistently, yeah.
I didn't buy an expensive house. I'm okay, but everyone else, right? That's the other concern here in South Korea.
Right,
That's the
right.
other reason why I think South Korea, their central bank, can't raise it. They can't take giant steps because of the already high.
Especially when
household debt.
many of people who are in their 20s and 30s bought homes last year, right?
No, you know what? I think the 20s and 30s they borrowed money and bought Bitcoin. I think that's the
Bitcoin.
And stocks, yeah.
Yeah, that's the big thing here, and I'm sure moving forward here, household debt, and this is why again I said this before, right, Sumin? I know
Yeah.
you joined us for first time in a really long time. I said that the housing prices are going to dip down
Yeah.
once the
Right.
interest rate goes up. It's not
Right.
going to
You
be
did
any
say that,
government.
uh-huh.
It's not going to be any government policies. No administration is going to be able to do this. We're going to see this.
And our producer says it's killing me. The interest.
Well, I mean,
Rate
it's
hikes.
he's not alone. He's not alone. What are we going to do, right?
Right.
We're going to move on to some other issues. North Korea and Russia-related issues. The two few allies that they have. Of course, when U.S. President Joe Biden took to the podium at the UN General Assembly on Wednesday, he addressed a wide range of topics. This mainly including North Korea's violation of UN sanctions as well as Russia's war on Ukraine. Sumi, let's get more on this.
Sure. So in his address at the UN General Assembly, U.S. President Joe Biden singled out North Korea, China, and Iran as major threats to the UN's non-proliferation goals. Well, if you specifically take a look at what the U.S. president had said, he said the U.S. is prepared to pursue critical arms control measures no matter what is happening in the world, basically slamming North Korea for continuing to violate the UN sanctions. And he also called out China for, quote-unquote, nuclear buildup without transparency, and also calling out Russia for its irresponsible nuclear threats to use nuclear weapons. He also explained that America seeks to uphold peace and prosperity across the Taiwan Straits and remains committed to its one China policy. Well, actually, much of his 30-minute-long speech was spared to address the Ukraine crisis, where he criticized Russia for violating the core tenets of the UN Charter. And then he endorsed support for Ukraine, urging world leaders to stand up for the principles that's stipulated in the UN Charter.
And North Korea on Thursday strongly slammed the U.S. accusation of selling arms to Russia. We talked about this on the show before. They were saying Russia is running out of ammunition, that they have sanctions, they have to seek out North Korea to buy this. Seong, tell us more about this.
North Korea's defense ministry, in a statement released by the Korean Central News Agency, said that recently hostile forces, including the U.S., have accused North Korea of selling weapons or ammunition to Russia, which is a clear violation of UN Security Council's resolution if it really happened. But North argued that this is not true. And it went on to say that North have not exported any weapons and it does not have any plans to do so in the future as well. And North Defense Ministry also harshly criticized the U.S. for spreading groundless rumors and trying to taint the regime's image. But at the same time, Pyongyang's officials said the development, production, and possession of military equipment, as well as import and export activities with other countries, are legitimate rights of sovereign states, and none of other countries is entitled to argue about them. Earlier, U.S. intelligence officials said in a recently released statement that Russia is purchasing millions of shells and rockets from North Korea to use them against Ukraine. And Pentagon spokesman Patrick Ryder also said at a briefing held earlier this month that it's true that North has exported weapons to Russia, and U.S. has evidence that Russia contacted North Korea to ask for ammunition.
Well, I guess we have to show the evidence in that case. I mean, it's so easy to say no. I mean, Iran said the same thing. You know, we had reports that Russia was buying drones from Iran, and then no, Iran just like, no, we didn't. You don't have proof. That's how usually it goes. It's really hard to get evidence of all this when it comes to,
Right.
trade of weapons and stuff like that. With the war in Ukraine continuing for now, we're 7 months
yeah.
now. Putin demanded mobilization of its citizens, escalating the ongoing conflict in Ukraine. So let's get more on this and wrap this up.
Sure. So Russian President Vladimir Putin on Wednesday local time announced the immediate partial mobilization of Russian citizens. Well, he emphasized partial. It's not a full-on mobilization of its citizens, with the defense ministers Sergei Shoigu, saying that the country will call up 300,000 reservists, which does not mean all citizens are subject to the call. It means that citizens who are in the reserve could be called up, and those with military experience would be subject to such conscription. Some are saying it's a representation of Putin's war faltering badly in Ukraine, and that there are efforts to reverse the current stalemate as they are believed to face shortages of manpower and military equipment. This is obviously a signal that the ongoing war in Ukraine could snowball into a longer conflict and a precursor that the conflict will escalate in the near future.
Can you imagine that? I wonder what the citizens, the Russian citizens, are going to feel about this. Basically saying, oh my goodness, now we have to fight. Mm-hmm. But I think it also shows you. One of the things that I learned about this, unfortunately, because of the war in Ukraine, is that the Russian army, the Russian military, is not as strong as what we thought it was.
Mm-hmm.
They use very outdated military equipment and things like that. But again, this war in Ukraine needs to end. But we have the referendum, which I believe is starting tomorrow. This for the Donetsk and the Luhansk region. And I'm sure because there's so much Russia backing there that it's going to be another 2014 Crimea referendum kind of situation. Guys, thank you very much for joining us in our program today with your report and your insights on some of these issues. Please stay safe and we'll see you guys again.
Thank you.
You can listen to Korea Now with me, SJ Lee, by downloading the Arirang radio application or tune in online by visiting www.arirangradio.com. So make sure you tune in Mondays through Fridays, 6 p.m. to 8 p.m. Korea time.